repair the stuff, then
Right.
they have bonds and stuff that we can.
Recording, we're good?
We can,
Okay.
yes.
Welcome to the October 4th, 2023 Planning Commission work session. We have a couple of items to cover, and you'll notice on the agenda we've kind of put some time frames because we've got a few things going on here, and some that have some implications for our work over the next couple months. And you know, the pickleball ordinance that coming from the city council, and the form-based code that has a lot of implications for, you know, the future. there's nothing saying that we have to get all of these things buttoned up today, but some of them, it might be nice if we can get to consensus, and then we'll go through the business agenda. So with that, why don't we jump into the form-based code update? And just for the sake of Commissioner Polson, did you get a chance when you're orienting him at all, Mike, to kind of jump in a little bit on where we're headed with that?
Yeah, we've talked a few times.
Great.
Some background, what it is, shared some recordings of previous discussions. So,
Great. Okay, well, let's jump in.
we'll invite Mark Morris up. He's our consultant.
Oh, great. I probably should have given you this seat. I can switch over here.
It's totally fine.
Okay, great. And I may eat while we're talking. if that's
Please,
okay.
just as a precursor, this is another overview. We're not looking, I mean, this is just to share kind of the last couple months of progress. The plan will be after the presentation and some general questions that we will share the actual draft ordinance with each of you. It's long, it's a lot of pages, so it'll take some time to get through it. So this is just kind of ramping up. So just to frame the discussion tonight.
Great.
Hey, Mark.
Are you gonna? There we are.
Got it.
Hey. Great, it's great to be back to talk a little bit about form-based code. Like Mike said, we have a draft of the full code, which is a lot of information. It's about 90 pages at this point. What we're going to look at tonight is really just an introduction to that draft, and hopefully kind of continue the conversations we've been having about the code. So just as a reminder, the form-based code is really only being applied to 3 areas in the city, all 3 of them on Fort Union Boulevard. We'll go through a little bit about what that means, but the intention is that we're applying this to areas that for the most part are already commercial and have been zoned mixed use for a long time. So next, Mike. So basically, we've got the way a form-based code is structured. The closest parallel to what we call a zone today is a form district. So in this code, we have 4 form districts that we'll be looking at. And really, the form district is driven by intensity of development and the context in which that area is defined. So the first form district is very specific to the Union Park Center area, where you already have mixed use, you have a good amount of office and commercial. The intention is over time, as this area develops and continues to grow, those areas will become more mixed use in character, where it's a little less just kind of an office park, something that has a little bit more of a mixed approach. So the area itself in the code as currently written, the minimum heights in those areas would be a 3-story development. The maximum would be an 8-story development. Currently, you've got a few buildings there that are already at 6 stories. So we're increasing the intensity there marginally, but opening the door a little bit for more development to happen there. Right. The second area, or the second form district that is considered in this code is specific to the town center area. And as you'll see from the prototype we go through, the town center area, the intention is to focus on the form of how this develops. This isn't a site plan or a specific development. The city is going through a specific process to actually design that Hillside Plaza project. So worth pointing out, the Hillside Plaza corner is really just one part of the town center area. So the code is applied to that whole intersection. The hope is that the Hillside Plaza development would be kind of the catalyst for more change in that area as private property redevelops. Great. The third form district is what we call the Fort Union Boulevard form district. So it's a larger portion of these areas is applied. That's really a lot of the commercial development that is along Fort Union in these areas that as they redevelop, that form-based code would apply. The intensity here is less than would be in the town center, less than would be in the Union Park Center. but would encourage a little bit more intensity of development in those commercial nodes. And then the last is what we call residential transition. Pretty typical in a form-based code to identify areas that would make sense to seek to buffer commercial development from the surrounding single-family neighborhoods. So these are areas, most of them are completely developed at this point. When redevelopment comes along, that residential transition form-based code would be applied to any change in development there. And this is the lowest intensity where you might see something up to 3 stories. Things that you're already seeing in the city that are townhome types of development, clustered housing, that sort of.
In that district, are they currently zoned residential? Are they currently R?
Most of these are. I don't want to miss one, but most of these are either commercial or multifamily zoning today.
Yeah, the way that we drew these boundaries look a little jagged, but it was really saying, okay, what makes the most sense to kind of draw the line to say where that node would stop. As I mentioned in past discussions, over time, the form-based code grows larger and you start applying it to more parts of the city. This is really just kind of first application for the city.
How did we determine these 3 districts?
We looked at a lot of different options. What we ended up with is looking at the areas in the city that were already zoned for mixed use. Form-based code and mixed use are a really nice close parallel. And so that's where we kind of drew the line to say, okay, it would make the most sense to start with those areas. And then in the future, once the city is used to what that process looked like, that other parts of the city would use the form-based code. So
With this being on the singular corridor, Fort Union corridor, did you study anything outside of it? Just so we can have a good scope of, maybe what form-based would do in neighborhood commercial spaces or any of that kind of stuff?
in this particular project, we looked at a few options and decided that it would make the most sense to focus attention in these, but we talked about Bengal, we talked about the gravel pit. There are lots of options to continue to expand this and apply it. Anytime you add to that form-based code, it's very much context sensitive. And so it isn't necessarily that these same form districts would be applied, but you would come up with something that would be similar in scale where, along Bengal, you've got obviously different intensity development than you have on Fort Union or anywhere else in the state. So
We started with Fort Union. You'll see even in this limited area, the 90-some page document is dense. It's a new way of looking, or a different way, I should say, of looking at land use regulation. But if we find success with this approach, this is scalable and expandable. And the whole idea behind form-based code is what works in the mixed use zone at Canyon Center versus what works in the mixed use zone, on smaller parcels across from Mount View Park is very different, yet today the code's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Form-based code allows us to say, okay, this park center area with all these office buildings and high traffic retail, we can treat that differently than we would treat Highland Drive, and we should treat 2300 East differently than both of those. So that's what form-based code is trying to help us achieve is more nuanced, context sensitive mixed use, but scalable. If it works here, then absolutely we can look at Bengal, we can look at, expanding it on Highland, other areas.
Wonderful.
Can we arbitrarily prescribe heights of the main floor, like asking for a higher ceiling height on a main floor? When I think about the town center, for example. And then also, is there, 3 stories? I look at the 3 and 4 stories over at the Cottonwood Mall property. And because they've fudged the grade, which happens because they're going to do a parking structure underneath, they are sticking out more like 6 stories. Obviously, the parking is awesome because you're dealing with the surface parking situation, but just as we think about parking and underground parking, effective grade, and I know that's a hard thing to memorialize, and once they start moving dirt around, grade seems to oscillate. It's not supposed to, but it seems like it does. Are there any things that you guys have found structurally that we can say, well, here's the effective grade. Even if it's like from the street that, you know,
Sure. The form-based code doesn't consider the kind of underground portions. It's really from that finished grade.
okay,
But to your first question, the building heights themselves, it very much treats ground floor heights separate from upper floor heights. Specifically in commercial development, that ground floor height is very important. And so having those separately required, the maximum heights that we're giving you here are kind of a simplified version of that.
Mhm.
You'll see in the document, there's a table that says, okay, here's your maximum number of stories. Here's the maximum height for the ground floor. Here's the maximum height for the upper floors.
is there a minimum height as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
The range.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I when I drive around Sugar House, I notice that they try to just squeeze as much as they can in terms of just as tight as they can get it per floor, but then as many as they can stack and as far out of the ground as they can get the parking structure. So it's not just, there's just not the curb appeal that I think we're hoping for the form-based
And
code.
we'll talk about that in the prototype that we look at, kind of how that
Awesome.
is dealt with. So got just a few more slides here. So Mike, oh, great. So the prototype, we've developed what we call a prototype where we've selected an example parcel. This one in particular is in the town center district on the corner of 23rd, just opposite from Hillside. We picked a 7-Eleven because we felt like if we start monkeying with what it looks like, no one's gonna get agitated too much. So what this prototype does is it goes through the main parameters of the form-based code. As the name implies, the focus really is on the form of development. Uses can come and go. If you've got a building that, you know, if a building is there for 100 years, it is going to have 10 different uses over 100 years. And so the intention is to create something that is infinitely reusable and that it's not so specific that it's this development. Once the Walmart moves out, it has to be torn down because no one can reuse it. So the intent is to focus on those things that are really difficult to change. So the prototype goes through site-specific parameters. The first is building location. And as with most of the parameters in the form-based code, there's a range where it says, okay, your minimum is this, your maximum is this. And so there is flexibility. So as properties develop, we haven't, you know, we're not designing every single parcel. We're just saying within this range, this will meet the goals of that particular area. The initial minimum building footprint, this one may address some of those concerns. There is a requirement for the required occupied space on that ground floor. And that's meant to, when you do have parking structures, to say, you know, if you need to structure that parking, that's fine. The first 30 feet of that building have to be occupied space. You can't just, there's a building downtown I like to talk about. It's around the corner from my office. It's a housing project. They have pulled the building right to the street. On the ground floor, all of these really nice windows, great architectural detail. Behind those windows are cars 6 inches away. And then they put a sticker in the window that says walkability. You know, they're selling walkability to these new residents. So the intention is to say structured parking is inevitable in some of these developments, but we need to make sure that that ground floor has some occupied space. So, Mike. The layout of the parcel is certainly considered in the form-based code. Again, the intention is to pull buildings up to the street, really start to define that as we're talking about town centers, walkable places. Nothing is going to be walkable if everything is 100 feet away behind 6 aisles of parking. So we're really using the public streets as that organizing principle, which is historically, that's how traditional development was created. So requiring that as far as where the building is located, what sort of setbacks, pushing the parking to the back. These are all things that the code really focuses on as far as the site layout.
A lot of these ideas come from the Fort Union Boulevard plan. That's why it's focused on that corridor, is we want to get buildings, especially if they're taller, we want to push them away from the residential that no matter where you go is, you know, a couple blocks north or south. So these standards kind of help that, you know, push the buildings to the front. They create the street presence. They can make an area feel more inviting to people and people out walking over time. And then they buffer the impact of the building away, hopefully, from the residential areas around them.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, thanks, Mike. And then as far as the form of the building, as with the other things, there's a range. So in these form districts, we have a minimum height, we have a maximum height. Ground floor height and upper floor height are considered separately. As with any development, the amount of parking that can be fit on the site is going to drive what that height is going to be. And so to say that, okay, there's a maximum of 4, that's not to say that every development that comes through is going to be a 4-story building. So building height is considered exterior of a facade. What you don't want is a building that's 300 feet long and is just flat as a pancake. That just is never going to look great. And so that articulation, we've kind of overemphasized that articulation in the graphic, but just to have that modulation in the facade. Again, these are very traditional development patterns, but it really codifies it. Like Mike mentioned earlier, you know, when you have mixed use, these things aren't as, they're really just kind of applied across anywhere in the city. With that facade articulation, the building heights, they're very much tailored to these specific districts. So
How do we determine parking ratio on these projects based on height and size and mass?
So the parking, we are still working through the parking requirements. They're not wildly different from the current parking requirements of the city. One thing that form-based code tries to do is put a maximum on parking. So to kind of give some range where really it's up to the applicant to determine how much parking is needed, make it a little bit more market driven. And also introducing a shared parking option where it has a very specific process to say, you know, we have all these retail places. Once they close, we've got empty parking for, 12 hours. That's a big waste of space for those hours. How do we try to share that parking in a way that's more efficient for the city? So parking is still kind of underway at this point.
What is other cities adjacent that use form-based, how have they determined it?
But that same way, we've had several discussions with Mill Creek City. They have a form-based code that's just applied to their town center, and they made a specific recommendation about shared parking. They said that was probably the best way to go. So every city, again, these are tailored specifically to cities, but we've kind of been communicating with them to understand how to apply it. So
I saw this done in Alexandria, our new association building, where they've strongly encouraged, almost mandated collaboration between the different buildings to negotiate through that because of the expectation that we're getting everybody off the street. Sure. And most of the challenges with not the public that's going to come in to frequent the building, it's the people that are employed there. So sure, separate from the people doing business, I do think that especially for the town center, we have the complicating factor that if we want that to be a gathering area, we do have to supply some parking. And so, like, I hope that, to your exact point that that we don't make the parking is limited to the boundaries of the property, that we have whatever the most creative solutions that are happening anywhere in the country. We make sure that we're doing that to just, I mean, we've already got one place where, in the corporate center where we could solve an enormous amount of the parking up the canyon, but they're not motivated at this point to work with anybody, even though those places from about now until, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning are going to be completely vacant. That to me, like, I mean, I'm fully expecting that this time of day in the town center, all the employees will move out and all the locals will move in to kind of do whatever we're going to do. So whatever works.
yeah, and that's something we've been talking about specifically and how to introduce that. So
a version of this happened with the northern gravel pit development, that 20-acre piece. If you took each of the phases of that development piece by piece and required parking on its own, there'd be way more parking required than what they ended up getting approved. And they did the same concept where they said, well, this use is busy during the day, this one's busier at night, so we can share that. This parking area is shared between uses. That was developed under the planned development district, so there's flexibility there. We're trying to build that in to the form-based code, because right now in the mixed use code, that's not in there. It's just what's your minimum parking for this use?
Yeah.
What is it for this use? What is it for this? And each one has to meet it. While still acknowledging parking is important. We are in a suburban community. There is going to have to be a need for parking. We want to provide that. So I think you'll see it's reasonable numbers, but provides good flexibility.
Well, and these areas that we're focusing on are very transit oriented. So I think if we take that into factor, how do we now take the transit and apply it to the parkability of these and potentially get either, this is kind of a swear word, but more density or better use. And I think if we're working through that, I would love to figure out how can we make these developments more transit oriented, especially for the east-west corridor. And parking is a huge factor, because if you have the parking, you will bring a car. There's less parking, but better transit will eliminate the cars and maybe promote more bike lanes, more bikes, more bus or shuttle, whatever that would be. So.
Yeah, and even think, just again, thinking pragmatically, realistically, even if some people, transit's an option, there's gonna be a lot of people that are never gonna use it, but if some people do, that's still an improvement.
Great,
Okay.
yeah, all good points. Last slide. Well, second to last slide. We've got pedestrian area improvements. So those are things like street trees and furnishings, landscape to improve the public realm that would be on the responsibility of new development as it redevelops. And then finally, use is really the thing that, up until today, use is the sort of first question. And really in this, it's kind of the last question, where we're giving lots of flexibility to say, okay, there are a lot of different use directions you could go, allowing it to be a little bit more flexible and market driven. This also considers ground floor use and upper floor uses separately. So the intention is to say, okay, what are the most activating uses that we can require for ground floor? What are the things that don't necessarily activate the street, but are really essential? So you think about office and residential moving upstairs, retail, restaurants, those sorts of things on the ground floor, where it's going to activate the street much more than if the street is just, empty offices that close at 5 o'clock. So again, the form-based code isn't tossing use out the window. It's just saying, make sure that the building form is where we need it to be before we worry so much about use. One of the carrots that is kind of dangled here for applicants and property owners is that the city has a lot more flexibility with use, where you can say, hey, I've got this specific use that we really think can happen. They can kind of choose their own adventure as far as that goes, as long as they're meeting the form requirements. So last slide. Last time we talked a little bit about the carve out for administrative approval under the form-based code. And so we talked about how, what percentage of the parcels in these areas would be under 1 acre, which is kind of where we set that. So your GIS staff did a little bit of analysis for us. The blue parcels that you see are all of those that are under 1 acre. It's a little bit less than 70% of the quantity of the parcels, but you can see quantity of actual space. It's a relatively small portion of these areas. Even if they are under that 1 acre size, there are a lot of prerequisites that they would need to meet before that's an administrative process. So they would have to go through and make sure they're meeting every aspect of that form-based code before it would be approved administratively. But I think from a city standpoint, focusing attention on those larger redevelopment projects and allowing those smaller projects to be more administratively approved, in the long run, that's going to be a win-win for everybody. You won't be bogged down by lots and lots of applicants, but also allowing for kind of a fast track for those that are meeting all the requirements and kind of helping the city achieve those aims.
So I have a question. Do we have a method for coordinating what we do with other municipalities in the area? I live near Creek Road, and it seems to me that Sandy has placed some businesses near Creek Road that are, I don't think the residents in my neighborhood would have wanted that.
Yeah. The answer is not really. I mean, we can talk to other cities, we can work with them. Certainly, we talked to Holiday on the gravel pit, and some of their concerns we were sensitive to and tried to design around it, but ultimately, Cottonwood Heights has its land use authority and Holiday has its and Sandy has its, and we kind of all exist on our own islands. So outside of being good community partners and trying to just communicate, there's not anything formal.
Official. That might be nice. Coordinate that.
I think when the form-based code does get expanded into other nodes, like, Creek Grove and Highland Drive, that's pretty significant. But I think that, I don't know of any areas of Sandy that have applied form-based code. I know Midvale does. But I think that coordination, I think that there will be some overlapping goals for those areas, and that'd be nice to coordinate that, so. Great, that was all we wanted to talk through to kind of introduce the draft that you'll see. Ian or Sam will send that over to you to start reading through. Like I mentioned, it's a lot of information. There are a lot of tables. When we come back again to kind of talk through the draft, please, let's talk through your questions and make sure that you have some clarity on what it is we're doing and why we're doing it.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, any other questions?
One that's probably off the wall a little bit, but
Sure.
Mill Creek's a very long, narrow city. Where do they consider their town center where they put this form-based code in?
Next time you're in Mill Creek, would drive by 33rd South and Highland Drive.
Okay.
You will see that, if you remember, there was the Joanne's and an auto body shop and a few things. That is all gone, and they're building a new city hall right there that's meant to be kind of the center of their,
So about 39th and Highland in that
30
area,
33rd.
33rd, sorry.
yeah.
Tres Hombres.
Yeah, Tres Hombres is staying.
Oh,
They're
yes,
very,
it is.
they're very excited that the city's building. it.
Just east of, west of Tres Hombres.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that the form-based code that they developed, we were involved with kind of a master plan for that area, and the form-based code was adopted right after that. They said they probably had, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 projects already go through their form-based code process. And so they've had some good advice for us on kind of how to apply that, kind of lessons learned here.
Thanks.
Yeah,
They're
check it out.
both
They're moving quick up there.
Yeah, the whole west side is also form-based code, if I remember correctly.
Oh, I know their town center is. I don't know more than that.
So I'd encourage you to be thinking about kind of that push-pull between what the right line is for the administrative side, so we can have that discussion. What portion, is, staff just took care of it, and what are the guardrails for that? So I don't know if that's a discussion for today, but it's fantastic.
It's great. Yeah, appreciate the time.
Thanks.
All right, we move on to item 2.0 pickleball court ordinance. So I don't know if any of you had a chance to listen. There was a few months ago, there were some really strong concerns voiced by some residents from around the community, and this is something that has been pushed to us from the city council. So
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, a couple council meetings ago, there was a moratorium placed on outdoor residential sport courts, I think is what they were called. And that was defined as any sport court over 500 square feet, which is going to cover any reasonable, basketball court, particularly pickleball court, tennis, things like that. There had been an uptick in residential pickleball courts being built, and neighbors expressing concerns over lighting and noise primarily. Concerns over those two things. And that resulted in, there was one application in particular that kind of riled up a whole neighborhood and led to some public comments, and the council saying, maybe we should stop and think about this. And pickleball does have a slightly different impact than even like an outdoor basketball court would in terms of noise. So they issued a moratorium, which means no residential sport courts are allowed to be constructed from the date of that ordinance, which was in September, for a period of 6 months, maximum. And the city in the meantime has, again, a maximum of 6 months to adopt regulations and get those in place, or the moratorium lifts after 6 months. So what you see tonight is an ordinance in response to that moratorium, and specifically in response to the issues of noise and lighting for outdoor sport courts. Because the council's direction was, hey, we're going to put a moratorium on this. We don't really want you to take 6 months. get something on the books as quickly as possible. We're focusing only on pickleball courts today. We'll come back in with more general sport court regulations, but the emphasis immediately is on sport courts. So I'm just going to walk through the preliminary draft that we've created. We have some definitions. We define general sport court and indoor pickleball court so that it's clear that those things are different than what our regulations are, which is outdoor pickleball courts. So we're talking about outdoor pickleball courts. So the two definitions really that are going to be relevant is what an outdoor pickleball court is, which I think is easy to understand. I'm not going to spend time on this, but you get people trying to get creative with code definitions, so we have to define it. And then qualified noise study, which I'm going to come back to after I get through the proposed regulations. We've got purpose and applicability, and really, again, the purpose is to address pickleball courts in or adjacent to residential zoning or residential uses, and in an effort to mitigate the unique impacts they present in terms of noise, lighting, and fencing. So we get into standards for approval. We'll just walk through that here. We're not proposing that these become conditional uses and come to the planning commission every time, but the kind of short summary of this is there's not, the best way to mitigate noise is by distance. There's not really another great way to do it in a way that's easily enforceable. You can put in requirements for hours of play. You can put in requirements that, you have to use certain surfacing and paddles and equipment. That stuff's a headache to enforce over time. So the easiest, most standard way to mitigate the impacts of noise that a pickleball court will have is with separation, just physical distance. So what you're going to see in here is a pretty aggressive distance in order to get that noise down to an acceptable level. Yeah.
Is there any evidence that pickleball is noisier than other outdoor activities
Yeah.
like swimming pools and?
Yeah, there is. So there's some studies out there that pickleball courts within, depending on what study you read, 100, 150, 200, sometimes more than that feet away from a property line. The noise of that can be 65, 70 decibels. We're shooting for 60. That's kind of what the noise ordinance of Salt Lake County sets as a reasonable spike in noise levels is 60, I believe. So there's evidence that where you have a plastic paddle and a plastic ball, and the pitch of that and the frequency of it does have creates a louder noise than a basketball or tennis, which is like 40 decibels.
So you would say those courts today are, when played on, the existing courts are in violation of the county noise ordinance?
Well, again, based on the studies we've never studied one in the city. We've never even had an actual enforcement case against these. We usually get the complaints at the permitting level. So we haven't seen that in the city, but the studies today that are out there show, the noise impact from pickleball courts is greater than other sport courts. So much so that there was an article, I think last week in KSL, that USA Pickleball, which is the official organization, is looking to update standards to specifically address the noise impacts from pickleball courts. So it's not just a concern here. As the sport rises in popularity, we're seeing this issue kind of everywhere. So what we've proposed is that, first of all, a building permit's required. Right now, to build a court that doesn't have fencing or lighting, there's no permit required. It's basically falls in the same category as landscaping in your yard. Where we require permits is for outdoor lighting and for fencing and kind of the things like that would serve the court.
And that building permit is required only for pickleball courts?
Right now, I think what you'll see, because the direction was given to focus on pickleball courts, that's what we're focusing on. We're going to come back with sport court regulations, and we're going to do the same thing for all sport courts. We're just trying to get through the moratorium and get regulations in place so we can do that.
It's funny just to come out of a conversation where we say, focus on form, not use. And we're going to go right to the use.
Right. This is
doesn't
unique.
make any sense.
Certainly, this is up for debate. This is the direction we were given, was get something in place, make it simple, make it quick. I mean, that's essentially what we were told. We can expand this to all outdoor sport courts. That's totally fine. But it says they require a building permit. should include site plan showing distance to the property lines, fencing details, standard stuff a building permit would ask for, outdoor lighting information.
What's required right now? So, I mean, what's required right now if you are to lay a 510-foot concrete
You're gonna
space?
build the slab.
In most areas of the city, nothing. In some areas where you have groundwater or other sensitive lands issues, there is an impervious surface requirement. So if you're in those areas, you'd have to come in and just justify that by pouring that hard surface, you're not exceeding your maximum impervious surface you're allowed on your property.
Okay,
But to pour a slab, again, it's more landscaping than anything.
so I just want to play devil's advocate on this, just to kind of play around with this. We go and build a 550 square foot slab. I sell my home. The next person now converts this to a pickleball court and it's right up against property line. What implications does that new homeowner have under this new ordinance for that?
Yeah,
And, is there going to be some type of a code enforcement issue that's going to come
yeah, it
into
would
place
be.
on that?
So if you had a slab that you were using for whatever patio.
Yeah.
Call it, and then a future owner used it for pickleball, that would be. Again, under these standards, a use violation that would be a code enforcement issue. It's not the fact that the pad exists, it's how you're using it.
Because they're still building a pickleball court. And so by this definition, it would require a building permit.
The same would apply if you had a big party in your backyard and you violated the noise ordinance.
Yeah.
Okay.
It would be a specific,
Well, no. That example is not accurate because this
This is land use.
is land use separate from noise ordinance.
sure, yeah,
But if you converted the use, I mean, if in the example where you've got the pad that was not originally intended as pickleball, and then you started playing pickleball. You've taken what exists there, because somebody could arguably set up a pickleball court on their driveway,
Which
as
I've
well.
done.
So again, the enforcement, again, I think go to the sound and light and
But-
noise.
What you're saying is they would be in violation of the land use ordinance.
right now, we're saying, we don't define pickleball court in the ordinance right now. We are proposing to define what a pickleball court is. Now, that includes how you use it, obviously, that's to play pickleball. So yeah, if you had a patio that is just flat work in your backyard, and then you convert it into a pickleball court. Now it's gonna fit the definition that is not currently defined, but we're proposing is defined as pickleball court, and if you're using that in a way that doesn't comply with whatever standards are adopted, then that becomes enforceable.
So if you had a basketball court.
Yeah.
And you decided to set up a net and hit pickleballs, you'd be in violation of the land use ordinance.
Yeah, so if I'll get through this quick, what we're proposing, again, based on the information, the studies out there, it's extreme, but it's 150 feet from property lines from distance alone to mitigate the noise impact that's been measured in other instances. 150 feet, again, doesn't even get you below 70 or 65 and according to some studies. Park City's ordinance is 600 feet. So we landed on 150. What that functionally means is pickleball is going to be seen, where you'll see these is in maybe, new developments that have common area that are singular to that development. It's an amenity at a planned unit development or an HOA or somewhere like that, where the outer boundary of that project is more than 150 feet away. There's some language in here that if you have residents in a condo association or something like that, they can sign off on it. And we're regulating that 150 feet to the outer boundary. This is going to make it difficult. We haven't done a parcel by parcel analysis to fit a pickleball court on any single family residential property in the city. But it does mitigate, again, the one concern we've heard over and over again, which is noise. There's not a much better way to mitigate than distance. There are standards for outdoor lighting and fencing. Those standards exist today. We're not really changing that. So if you install outdoor sport court lighting today, we have an outdoor lighting ordinance that's going to regulate height. It's going to regulate the temperature of the light, the brightness of it. And where we've seen concerns with lighting is in cases where people build lighting without a permit and it's too tall and it's too bright and it's glaring into neighbor properties. But in almost every instance, if you follow our lighting ordinance today, it's going to resolve most of those issues and providing cutoff and reasonable regulations.
Likewise, there is an ordinance for sound today.
There is.
So you already have this covered.
And we have stated that there's a noise ordinance. So this was all shared with the council. And then fencing, we have a fencing ordinance right now. If the fence is on the property, it can be a certain height. You can increase the height of the fence if you set it back off property lines. So it's a pretty basic, again, the biggest thing for your consideration is the proposed setback for these pickleball courts. Again, the sole purpose of these setbacks proposed is to mitigate noise based on studies and research that we've read. That where the noise study comes in is, we've built in a reduction. You can cut the setback in half if you have a qualified noise study done showing how you're going to buffer the sound and dilute the sound enough so that at property lines, with your extra mitigation, the noise levels won't exceed that. I think 65 decibels at the property line.
So there could still be code compliance issues from noise, even with this. So if the next door neighbor says, I don't like the noise, they measure and it's, let's just say he's got a hard hand and he's really thrown down, or she.
Mhm.
It hits noise compliance issues. We're still going to run into that same issue. Is that?
You could, yeah.
Okay.
The noise regulations come from the county health department, so that's where that is routed through.
This does not eliminate, this ordinance does not eliminate any possible noise violation. I mean, if they build this, they meet all this and it's still noisy.
They're
it's
trying to
still-
mitigate
It's
it.
still noisy. I mean,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, to be clear, there are noise standards today. It would fall under nuisance, kind of nuisance category violations. There were concerns that people are renting out residential pickleball courts for commercial tournaments, essentially commercializing residential courts. I would argue that can be enforced today because you need a business license to use your residential property for commercial enterprise. So that could be enforced today. Lighting and fencing are pretty well regulated today. Again, that being said, the direction from the council is we understand what's in place, but we need to study this further. So this is the information to address noise best. You add distance.
Do you think we should add something in here about that? I don't know the right legal way to say it, but by means of defining this does not negate the fact that there still could be noise violation. You know what I mean? Like, even if you have followed all this, it does not mean you are still not responsible for noise.
Yeah, you could certainly
Yeah,
build a language, all
Yeah.
other ordinances still apply.
Because I think
for sure.
someone could read this and say, oh, well, I met X, Y, Z, did all these things with my pickleball court. You can't tell me I'm too noisy now.
Well, no one can build one. So you're gonna effectively eliminate the construction of any court if someone's gonna play pickleball in a residential area. So the noise from that use is totally blown away with these regulations.
And you can just, you can come out and say that. You can say no in single family zones, maybe there's no mitigation that's acceptable for the council and you just say they're not allowed. There is some
Well,
validity
you
to say.
essentially said that because there's not, you can't build one with a.
Whose yard is that big? It's 300 feet and
I
three
mean,
directions.
it's
at least.
1% of.
Yeah, it's not many. Frankly, it's not many. Where I see this working is in a planned development district, a redevelopment area where you build an apartment complex or some sort of private community. You put a pickleball court as an amenity in the center of it. And to the outer boundary of that development project, it's 500 feet in any direction and it's an amenity to the people that live there. Renee just did this. So, that kind of idea.
I think though, if you're gonna extend it, you're gonna hit tennis courts, pickleball courts, basketball courts, swimming pools. Kids playing music in their home.
I would love the commission's feedback to bring along to the city council on this. Staff didn't recommend a moratorium, that was just voted on, so.
This is, it's interesting. We've never heard complaints about, other than the occasional noisy neighbor kind of a thing, but those seem to be one-offs, I think, going way back. But this is like, this is not one or two people that are complaining about this. This is, and not like a dozen. This is like dozens and dozens and dozens of people throughout the city. So but I share your concern. It's like, well, okay, now that a light's being shined on it, I'm curious, where is it going to go? So, but I do think that when we talk about the noise ordinance, to your point, it may be simply saying as a reminder, or however we phrase it, you know, that the noise ordinance applies throughout the city, regardless of the circumstance. And I mean, really, I mean, you can get on Amazon for $29.99. You can get a decibel meter that will range from 25 to 150. You can put it at the top of your fence if you want. I mean, that there are avenues to address the noise, and so there's a part of me that wonders if I mean, if we leave it and just simply point out publicly that, you know, you can measure the noise and you could make the complaint through the county health department. The other thing is that the other unintended consequence might be that they're going to build a slab of cement for some unknown purpose and then start playing pickleball in it,
By this ordinance, they'd be in violation.
which they would. Well, if they didn't say what it was for, if they didn't call it a pickleball court.
It says though, as soon as they start playing pickleball on it,
Yes,
It's a
correct,
pickleball court.
correct, yes.
Yeah, and
So-
there is credence to treat pickleball differently. If, again, if the commission goes this way, then tennis, then basketball. The noise impact is, and we can
and
share
swimming.
studies and things like that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's
It's far worse.
it's the frequency, because usually you're playing, a lot of times playing doubles, pickleball, and you're close to each other, so it's constant bing, 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 bing. And it's plastic on plastic on a hard surface, so it's a high pitch as well. So it's the volume and the frequency, and it is different than other outdoor uses. Which is why, you know, it is reasonable if this is a real concern to single out pickleball differently than other outdoor recreation uses.
But I think you single out noise. That's the issue. And when you single out a use rather than the offense, that's when you get into the wrong space. And here you're talking about dealing with an issue of noise. And as you just brought up, there are several ways to mitigate the noise, including using different equipment. And if the noise is what you're trying to regulate, and you just pick out pickleball as being the noisiest, I think you've missed the boat. You're trying to attack noise. And if the current ordinances are not effective for attacking noise, then find a way to improve your attack of noise. But to pick on a particular use, I think is really the wrong direction.
But I don't know that a game of pickleball could be played and not be in violation of the noise.
Do you know that it couldn't?
Well, I don't know what equipment there is that you can play pickleball with, that pickleball equipment that's not.
There is. So
Oh, there is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like in what circumstance?
you
Just
can,
different.
there's
just
different balls and paddles that reduce the noise.
Okay.
So you can play pickleball and have it be quiet.
Yeah, there's some concerns about doing, you know, code enforcement equipment checks. You know, I don't know.
That's why you're not gonna
Yeah.
check equipment, you're gonna check noise. And if noise is the problem, then attack noise. But here you say nothing you could do would mitigate it, even if you're quiet. And that doesn't make sense.
I think the concern too I have is with homeowners thinking that it's fine for them to build a pickleball court, not being aware of potential impacts of doing so, of using their land in that way. And then they'll come back and say, well, there is nothing you said anywhere at Cottonwood Heights about that. I mean, there's noise ordinances, but I think to be fair, if someone's gonna take that expense and time to build a pickleball court, we should be in a place where something I feel like needs to be said. Maybe it's under a sport court ordinance with some note about that if you build any kind of, maybe all sport courts need a building permit. Maybe we have to go down that route or something. I don't know, but I mean, I think we've got to have something that addresses. So
Yeah, I mean, I have a basketball hoop in my driveway. Am I gonna need a permit for that?
that's not a sport court.
Well, it is.
Yeah, but-
Basketball.
But you're making the noise. If the noise is the issue and
The noise is no
basketball in your driveway is creating noise that your neighbors are annoyed with, then that's the issue, is the noise.
The noise.
It isn't what you're doing.
Because it is use, because you know what I think we're trying to look at is the use of sport court, which we haven't worked through the definition of that, but. You know, I'm just on Google Maps. I've now identified 5 pickleball courts in Cottonwood Heights right now that will be immediately illegal. You know, with this ordinance. So there's not going to be any use permits for that, you know, it's something that.
But there are way more than that.
Anything that's,
Just
anything that's in
here.
today is, I mean, if it complies with whatever, if there's lighting or fencing, if that's compliant today, that's allowed.
Yeah.
But so long as you don't have to do some little thing that requires you to get a building permit. Because then you're gonna be out of compliance again. As soon as you need a building permit, your court is dead.
And that's where I look at the use standpoint, and I think identifying use, I mean, if there is ways, you know, just as Shelton was saying. If there are ways that we can alleviate noise and make it more of a code enforcement issue from a noise reduction, I feel like that is more so what we need to be focusing on instead of a land use standpoint. Primarily because land use now just takes away from property rights. And it's something where if we're taking away from property rights from, you know, somebody here, or if somebody just decides to start playing pickleball on their 550-foot slab that they already have built right up against the fence. It's more of a respect of neighborhood. It's a respect of your neighbors, you know, what hours are you using this? And if it's outside of noise compliance with the health department, you know, it's hard to restrict. And I don't know if we want to be restricting outdoor activities truly for private, you know, a lot of pickleball owners, you know, it's 55 plus, you know, in that space, and they're creating this for more outdoor experience. And I think as a city, setting that precedent that we want to restrict outdoor experiences and with it being a use standpoint, it doesn't sit well. And I have some concern with it. And this ordinance makes it so that no one can do this into perpetuity when, you know, there's 5 in a 2-minute period that I was able to find right now. So what is going to justify it? And I think what we need to be looking at is the noise standpoint, just as you mentioned, instead of the land use standpoint, because if it's a basketball court that's converted by the next homeowner and they just paint some lines in it, you know, that basketball court is now a pickleball court and now it's illegal. And then if they end up selling it and now somebody has an illegal pickleball court in their backyard, if they try to do anything, they're going to get in trouble, you know, with code enforcement and land use as well. So this basically bans anybody to create that. And I feel like as a city between the canyons, we want to encourage people to be outside. And I think the demographic that we're focusing on is, you know.
But I'm gonna say, I don't disagree, except that it is not in the spirit of community to have something in your yard that's very, very noisy.
Sure.
I think that
Yeah,
is.
then deal with
Well,
the
that's why we have
noise.
to deal with noise.
Right,
Yeah.
I agree, but there's no acceptable time for the noise. Right? I mean, the noise ordinance is applicable. Is it applicable?
There's quiet hours, and then, yeah, the noise or the maximums are applicable at any
Always,
point. Yeah.
right,
It's sustained noise above a certain point, and it's spikes in noise above a certain point.
So,
Regulated.
We can play our music more loudly in the afternoon than in the evening, is that? I mean, I
I'm
don't
sticking with the county
know.
noise
Yeah.
ordinance says.
Yeah, that's correct. If
And then
it's 2 o'clock in the morning,
At 10 PM,
I can't
10 PM to 6 AM, you gotta get a lot quieter.
So, and I just remind us, I think we generally feel like when what you do in your property, within your property rights, we want to protect that as much as we possibly can. But when you start affecting your neighbors with what you do, we have concerns about that. So I think this ordinance was born out of that.
Here's the request. This was direction from the council. You mitigate noise with distance. We frankly, fencing, lighting, other things we've heard as concerns, I will say is well addressed in today's ordinance. Noise is in the noise ordinance today, but if we know that in most cases, a pickleball court, you know, closer than a certain distance from a property line is going to create a noise violation and are just creating an enforcement headache for the code enforcement department. What I would ask for is if this is unpalatable we can come back to the next meeting. If you have ideas for regulations that could address noise, or if there's not any and we just forward a recommendation along to council that says, just enforce your current ordinance. That's what I'm looking for is feedback. This is a starting point for discussion.
Okay.
One question I have, is what about the courts that are already built? Are we grandfathering them in and they're in a different set of rules?
Yeah, they were, if
Or how
courts
to-
that have been under construction or built prior to the ordinance existing. Yeah, if something about them, if a fence was built illegally or they built lighting that doesn't comply, they don't get a pass on that necessarily. If it was built illegally initially, then it's still illegal, but if it complies with everything today and it was already in place before the moratorium.
Yeah.
It's allowed to.
Okay, we're gonna have to pause. We
So-
have 4 minutes before we,
And we can cover if you want, we can cover the other items.
I think we're decided that we're gonna push this forward to another meeting.
Right, so what my request is to come with specific recommendations, so we can formulate something that the commission can take a vote on.
And I would ask wherever possible, if we can come up with evidence, if we're gonna come up with a size requirement. I would like to see like a legally defensible, somebody studied that this distance equates to this range. And if that doesn't exist, that may be a little bit of a challenge, but let's see what we can find. You guys can,
And could I also say, we have a meeting in 2 weeks, so, and so let's talk about it then. Can we get ideas to you, thoughts, so you can develop something for us then to review? So I think we all could get something to Mike or Ian or Sam, whoever you want it to be, within a week. We can get something over to them in a week. I don't think.
Yeah, we can do that,
that's
or we
reasonable.
can send the draft to you, and you
Okay.
guys, you can
That would
all
be
provide your input, and
Yeah.
then. Because we have 3 meetings in a 6 weeks period.
True,
So
oh,
we
that's
could
right.
come back in November.
I'm just trying to
Draft, yeah. I
get her,
appreciate it.
get her done,
I do appreciate it.
get her done.
So we'll send this out after me.
great
Perfect.
dialogue. Thank you, everybody. Okay, we ready to go through the business session agenda?
I would actually propose we just do that in the business meeting,
Okay,
because we have 2 minutes left.
okay, great.
We'll just be getting started before, but we've got a detached ADU, which is a conditional use that you'll see, and then the transportation master plan.
Is there anyone that has burning questions that they feel like they would rather cover here versus in the other room? Okay. Great, well, then, we just had one more at every business.
Motion to adjourn?
Second. Motion second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.